big issue on campus. It's come up, and I think the only one where I didn't hear that mentioned was alumni relations, and that makes sense because students are off campus at that point. So Yvette and I had counseling and psychological services, and as student affairs professionals, we're all going to be doing a little bit of counseling with students, but as we saw in our readings, it's more of counseling helpers. We are not licensed professionals. In times of crisis or when it gets to a certain level, it needs to be handed over to counseling and psychological services. So to kind of help you guys, we've heard a lot of anecdotal stories about mental health, but to kind of really paint the picture for you guys so you can see what's really happening out there, we've got a little quiz show for you with some statistics. And Yvette, our stress baker, has baked some treats for you. So the way this is going to work is we're going to ask some questions. There's going to be multiple choice answers. First person to answer will win a prize. So
answer correctly.
Let's go ahead.
One of these prizes.
Yes, one of these prizes. Not one of those prizes. Hold on. All right. So for our first question, in a survey that happened in 2014, 275 college counseling centers were surveyed, and the directors of these centers were asked about the 3.3 million students that are attending their institutions. So who can guess what percentage of those students sought either individual or group counseling in the last year? I'm going to put out some numbers.
Oh. Thank you.
Yes. And the first person to answer will win. All right. Was it students seeking out counseling 3%, 11%, or 21%?
21%.
Nope.
11%.
Yes. Yep, it was 11%. So just to give you some context, so 11% of students that at St. Thomas, that's what they see. They have about 650 students per year. That's 10% of the undergraduate population. So these are poor. Oops, there's the answer. So these are poor college students, right? How are they affording this counseling when they're coming in? What percentage of these counseling centers do you think charge fees for students? Do you think it is 5%, 25%, or 55%?
5%.
Yes. Well, about 4.7% of these counseling centers, and the mean fee that they're charging students is $20. In my informational interview, I talked to the director at St. Thomas, and I asked her, "How is this paid for? Is it getting paid for through insurance? How does that work?" And she said, "It's really so complicated to pass it through insurance. You have to actually diagnose somebody with a mental disorder to pass it through insurance." She's like, "We just deal directly with students." A lot of these centers are supported by student health fees, general student life fees, and that sort of thing. Okay, so number 3, directors were asked if they've seen a steady increase in the number of students arriving on campus that are already on medication. Do you guys think that is psychiatric medication? Do you guys think 26% of directors said they're seeing that? 56% or 86%?
86.
Yep, 86% of directors said that they're seeing that. And that also came out in the informational interviews. People are coming in with more of a therapy background as well. Okay, so what are these students getting help for? Over the past 5 years, what are the primary psychological problems that center directors say that they're dealing with? Who can come up with the number one thing that centers are dealing with?
Anxiety.
Yep, that's it. That's number 1. So on this slide, you can see these are the things that counseling centers are dealing with when students are coming in. Crisis, psychiatric medication issues, depression, all of those sorts of things. So speaking of anxiety, the National College Health Assessment talked directly to students, and they asked them all sorts of health questions, physical health, all sorts of questions. So they asked students, have you been diagnosed or treated by a professional for anxiety within the last 12 months? What do you think, what percentage of these students that were surveyed said that they were? Do you think it was 4%, 14%, or 44%?
44%?
Nope.
14.
Yep, 14%. 14% of students. So, and this is, over here, you can see, this is what people are saying that they've been treated by a professional for, those things. All right, we're gonna ask one more question before that gets into some of the nuts and bolts of the area. They were also asked whether academics, among other things, had been traumatic or very difficult to handle within the last 12 months. So what percentage of students identified academics as traumatic or very difficult? Do you think it was 1/4 of students, 1/3 of students, or 1/2 of students? What do you think?
1/3?
Nope.
Half?
Yes. Wow. 1/2 of students.
What?
So,
Wow.
yeah, and the words traumatic or very difficult, I thought that was really interesting. This is what students are dealing with. We can put this on Blackboard if you guys want to go back and look at it at some point. But yeah, that's what's going on with students.
Okay, so counseling and psychological services, also known as CAPS, I think is one of the functional areas a lot of people are more familiar with because every single functional area ties into it. Like the layout and look of a CAPS program can look different. Oh gosh. At different institutions. Okay, so I'm not going to go over like the background and history because I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and you have our handout. But what we saw in a lot of our interviews, especially in mine, was that resiliency is a very big problem in our students that are coming in, and just how we develop resiliency. And that although, sorry, I'm just, that 5 minutes threw me off there. So there's been a report that like an overwhelming amount of students are needing services provided by CAPS. And in those, there's still not as many students utilizing that service as there should be. And keeping that in mind, that CAPS services across the nation, they need more resources. They physically do not have enough people to help address all of these mental health concerns, because we're seeing a rise in students coming in who are already diagnosed, who are already on like psychiatric medicine, who are already struggling with anxiety and depression, who are very stressed out because of their dependence and value on relationships, performing like a high performance, and that we just don't have the resources to help these students in the way that they need to be helped. So a lot of programs, especially like community colleges, they're having to outsource and send those residents to outside counseling services, who then are told, yeah, a student can like come back, but they do need regular like scheduled counseling. I think someone mentioned that yesterday. But it's a very prevalent problem. And as like funding and like budget cuts are being seen across the board, this is an area that needs a lot more than what they already have. So I was trying to give like the big broad thing so you can do your last two like questions.
So these last two questions were some interesting pieces of information that could possibly make interesting critical issues papers for people. So pay attention to these ones. There was a different study. This one talked to 100,000 college students who had come into university counseling centers for help. So they already had come in and said, I need help. So these students were asked about thoughts about self-harm, about suicide attempts, or desire to cause injury to others. And this study was unique because this one people could choose to identify as male, female, transgender, or self-identified. And over 732 people chose one of those options. So looking at the results of their research, keeping in mind that all these people came into a counseling center saying, I need help, do you think that their levels of thoughts on these things were about equal, or do you think maybe one of these groups had a higher instance? What do you think? What do you think?
Transgender and self-identified students, I would assume they'd have a higher rate.
Yeah, that's true. You can see that in here, and again, you guys can look at these things closer, but if you look at it, if you look at that bottom red line on the bottom down there, you can see just the big difference as you go across towards that. And Allie asked about transgender issues in res life. That was another thing I heard from a coworker of mine who used to be a hall director, dealing with that sort of thing too. It's an issue that for her, for my coworker, that student didn't want people to know that they were transgender. So like some of these people, it's not something that you can see. It's not something you know that they're dealing with. So it's just something to keep in mind. And then finally, the last question. Oh, don't look at that slide. These 3 large surveys were interesting because they all collected information about race and ethnicity, but the results weren't often reported in a way that was broken down by race and ethnicity. So in one case, there was a breakdown, and if you look at it, that last column says effect size, and right there they say effect sizes of 0.2 are considered small, 0.5 are medium, 0.8 and higher are larger. So it says there's not that much difference, is basically what this slide is saying. They're saying that students from all backgrounds, there's really not that much difference. But there's a couple things to keep in mind as Yvette was saying, only about 10% of psychologically distressed college students come in for help. We heard that in the beginning too, about 10% of St. Thomas students, 11% from that other survey. So what about the students that aren't receiving counseling? Are students of color less likely to walk into counseling and psychological students and ask for help? We do know from all of the information that we've had so far, students of color are more likely to view predominantly white campuses as unwelcoming and isolating and receiving less support from student services. They also have higher rates of attrition, greater academic worry, lower cumulative GPAs, and these are all issues that contribute to stress and anxiety. So, looking around, some studies have shown that students of color underutilize counseling services, others have shown that they don't. So there's not a lot of clarity. It would be something really interesting, I think, for somebody to dig into. And so it wasn't a big part of these surveys, but there's definitely researchers out there tackling the topic, and there was one survey that focused on the experiences of racial and ethnic minority college students. This is our last question. Okay. The study found that one minority group experiences a higher level of academic distress when they come into counseling and psychological service. They're feeling it more than other students. And yet they also change the least after treatment. So which group do you think it was? Do you think it was African American students, Latino students, or Asian American students? I've already called on you. Okay, you.
African American?
No?
Asian American.
Yeah, that's true. So this is just something to keep in mind when you're working with people. Perception is reality. You know, there could be students that you're dealing with that are feeling something more intensely. Maybe they're having, this study didn't go into it, but maybe they're having pressures, academic pressures from their family that are stronger than other students, and that sort of thing. So hopefully that helped paint a picture for you guys. I got really excited about all the statistics. And Yvette has something for everybody.
Yeah, everyone's eating. So,
Yes.
there are chocolate chip muffins,
What?
or someone can have this last bag.